All right, so listen, we have all our panelists here. I'm going to do a very quick welcoming before turning this over to this wonderful group that is leading today's session. So good morning and welcome everyone to this very special Grand Rounds of our HIV Center. This Grand Rounds is commemorating the 40th anniversary of the first MMWR report of the early reported cases of an illness that was unknown at the time and unnamed at that moment in time, but came to be known, as we all know, the disease called AIDS caused by HIV. We have a highly distinguished panel of speakers today, and I will turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Teo Sanford in just a minute, who will be introducing and moderating the panel. But first, let me welcome everyone here today. And also, I want to give a very special welcome and shout out to a distinguished guest in our audience, who is Dr. Zena Stain, who many of you know because she is she's famous, and she's the founding co-director, along with Anka Earhart, of our HIV Center, which began back in 1987. As many of us who were around, we refer to this at times as the dark and very challenging days before there were effective treatments. So welcome, Zena. We're so glad that you're here with us, and it's always lovely to see you. And let me also remind everyone about our final HIV Center Grand Rounds in 2 weeks. We have Rafael Landowitz from UCLA and the HPTN speaking about long-acting HIV prevention. His title is Injectable PrEP, Current Knowledge and Outstanding Questions. So please join us for that session in 2 weeks. That will be the last rounds of this academic calendar year. We'll be taking July and August off. Okay, now I'd like to invite Dr. Teo Sanford, who is the director of the development core of the HIV Center. It is that core that has organized today's very special event. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Teo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. As Bob Remien mentioned, this is a special round to commemorate that 40 years ago, the MMWR reported on the first cases of what we now know as AIDS. But we do this in the context of another epidemic, and from which we seem to start to be recovering. And to connect the two epidemics, I would like to read a few lines from a piece that the author Alexander Chi wrote in the New York Times a year ago on June 21st. I quote, "The first weekend of the coronavirus shutdown in March, my husband, Dustin, and I made calls to family and friends to discuss our plans. Most of them were already adjusting to the idea of a pandemic unlike any we had seen before. But it was already feeling like one I had seen before. I am used to not doing everything I want to save myself from a virus, and they are not," Dustin said. I wasn't alone in feeling an immediate parallel. This virus is not that virus, some of my fellow AIDS activist veterans wrote in those first weeks, trying to make room for each virus to have its own identity and history. Absolutely, I agreed, even though I kept feeling the undertow. This virus is not that virus. But this country is still that country." End of quote. For today, we organized a panel of 5 speakers who will share what this 40-year anniversary means to them, and each will do so from their own perspective. We invited persons who lost loved ones and friends to AIDS, took care of AIDS patients from the start of the epidemic, are living with HIV, or use the arts to infuse and bolster AIDS activism. And let me introduce them briefly. Ron Bayer will set the stage. Ron is professor in the Department of Sociomedical Sciences here at Columbia University. And part of his research focuses on issues of social justice and ethical matters related to AIDS. He has published extensively about HIV/AIDS and is author of seminal papers such as Public Health Policy and the AIDS Epidemic, An End to HIV Exceptionalism. Our second speaker is Jesse Milan. Jesse is president and CEO of AIDS United. And the mission of AIDS United is to end the AIDS epidemic in the United States through strategic grant making, capacity building, policy and advocacy, technical assistance, and formative research. Jesse is a nationally recognized expert on HIV/AIDS policies and programs, and he currently also serves as the Chair Emeritus on the Black AIDS Institute Board of Directors and on the Scientific Advisory Board of PEPFAR. Our third speaker is Wafaa El-Sadr. Wafaa is University Professor of Epidemiology and Medicine at Columbia University. She is founder and current director of ICAP. ICAP is a global leader in HIV and other global health threats. And in her role as director, Wafaa leads the design, implementation, scale-up, and evaluation of large-scale HIV, TB, and maternal child health programs in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. ICAP provides access to HIV services to more than 2.2 million people. And Wafaa also holds the Dr. Mathilde Krim MPhar Chair in Global Health. After Wafaa, Rombe will speak again based on his work with healthcare providers, looking back at 40 years of AIDS history. Then we will hear from Dana Diamond. Dana is a credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor and has been working for over 20 years at Exponents. And Exponents is a New York-based nonprofit serving people impacted by HIV/AIDS, substance use, incarceration, and behavioral health challenges. And at Exponents, Dana is Director of Health Services. And we will conclude this session with Abram Finkelstein. Avram is an artist, writer, and gay rights activist. He was co-founder of the Silence Equals Death project, which created the Silence Equal Death anti-AIDS logo to combat institutional silence surrounding homophobia and HIV/AIDS. Avram also is a founding member of ACT UP and the AIDS art collective Gran Fury. So those are our speakers of today, and I would like to switch to Ron.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. As Bob Remien said, June 5th marked the 40th anniversary of the publication in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report of the first indication of what was to become the AIDS epidemic. What it said was between October 1980 and May 1981, five young men, all active homosexuals, were treated for biopsy-confirmed pneumocystis pneumonia. All three at 3 hospitals in Los Angeles. 2 had already died. On the basis of those cases, the CDC hypothesized that there was an association between some aspect of a homosexual lifestyle or disease acquired through sexual conduct and pneumocystis pneumonia in this population. Let's say in noting this, that in those early days, language like that, homosexual lifestyle, sexual behavior, was indeed controversial and is important to remember as we think back to those moments. By the end of 2019, what had come to be known as AIDS had taken the life of 700,000 people in the United States and more than 32 million people globally. At its peak, AIDS killed 50,000 people in the United States in a single year, primarily gay and bisexual men and injection drug users and their sexual partners. When, after 1995, effective antiretroviral treatment was available, an AIDS diagnosis no longer signified an inevitable death. An editorial published in New England Journal of Medicine in 1998 announced that, quote, "The good news continues in the battle against AIDS. In the United States, the age-adjusted death rate among people with human immunodeficiency virus in 1997 was less than 40% of what it had been in 1995. I see this meeting as an opportunity to fulfill our moral obligation to remember, an obligation to look back, to remember the suffering, the pain that defined AIDS in America and globally in those years. I believe it is also important to remember so that next generations do not forget. Do not forget what it was like in the early days of the epidemic. And with that, I turn it back to Taylor.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you for pointing out the importance of remembering. And to inform everybody here on this seminar, Ron was actually the person who said that we should have this meeting. So thank you, Ron. Okay, let me switch to Jesse Milan. Jesse.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone in the center for all that you do. The work that you do is critically important, and it lifts us up to know that there is hope for all of us who are impacted by HIV and AIDS. I'm Jesse Milan. I'm the president and CEO at AIDS United. And as you heard, we're a national organization focused on ending the HIV epidemic through our strategic grant making. Over our history, we've given away about $120 million to grassroots organizations across the US. And our policy and advocacy, I'm proud to say that we are the leading HIV/AIDS organization for bringing the voices of people to Congress and to the administration to advocate for policies and appropriations necessary for ending this epidemic. And through our technical assistance and capacity building, we help grassroots organizations do better at achieving their mission. And I'm thrilled to be here because this 40th anniversary is meaningful to me personally and professionally. Ron mentioned the importance of remembering, and I have to say, because I've been known as a longtime survivor and I've been called on in this 40th anniversary to reflect so much, that I think it's important to understand, because I had to force myself, because I was very wary of having to go back and remember so much. I had to force myself to understand that remembering is not the same as reliving. The trauma of 40 years ago, of 4 decades ago, is not something I need to relive. Although with the coronavirus, we may very well be reliving it. But remembering helps us understand what is necessary in the present. And the present, with the coronavirus pandemic and with our political environment, we can learn so much by remembering the past. But for me, that past is really about the convergence of my personal and professional lives around HIV/AIDS. And so as I go back and give you some reflections from my life over each of the decades of HIV, I want to start at the beginning. Start at the beginning, right down the road from all of you, when I graduated 40 years ago this month, do the math, from NYU Law School. I was starting out in June of that year, 1981, got my first big job, getting my own apartment, getting new friends, moving to a new city, starting my new life as Ron said, an active, open homosexual. Wow, what a concept. 1981, and I was a 20-something, soon to be, I hoped, openly gay man. But I have to tell you, I have no recollection whatsoever of June 5th and the MMWR. And I doubt that so many of us do. But I do have strong recollections of the evening news and the newspaper referring to this new thing, this new disease called GRIDS, G-R-I-D-S. Gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome that was killing gay men, particularly on the West Coast in San Francisco. And so I thought there's something going on in the Castro. I don't know what it is, but it's out there and it's not about me. Except that the G I knew was about me. And so there was this terror that was nascent in my soul. 1 year later, I fell in love. And within a matter of 2 weeks after my first encounter with the man who would become my partner, I got incredibly sick. It was the summer, and the flu-like symptoms that rocked me down and sent me home for 3 days shocked me and frankly scared me, because as a newly minted lawyer in Philadelphia, it was the first time I had to take any days off. I was that sick. But that bout of illness was nothing compared to what my partner experienced within a matter of years. First, the white spots on his tongue and in his throat that would not go away. Next, the purple lesions that suddenly appeared when we saw them in the shower. Next, the loss of weight, the loss of energy, even the need to be pushed in a wheelchair. And then finally, the pneumocystis that took his life in December of 1985. Suddenly, at the age of less than 30, I wasn't even 30, I found myself planning a memorial service, planning a funeral, managing an estate, having to sell a business and a house, and then having to deal publicly and privately with being an AIDS widow. And what did that mean for me as a now openly gay man? The task was hard. So the 1980s for me were defined by death and stigma. The stigma of people staring and avoiding, the stigma of internal shame, the fear of wondering who had it, did you have it? And the very, very hard work of developing the infrastructure to actually take care of us. If we didn't take care of ourselves, who would? If we as gay men did not take care of ourselves and teach each other how to be safe, who would? That hard work, the stigma, and the death, those are the things that I recall from the 1980s. But the 1990s for me were about a different level of infusion of the epidemic with my professional life. I became the first chair of the Rhine-Wide Planning Council for the Philadelphia greater metropolitan area. And in 1995, I became AIDS director for Philadelphia. I can tell you that those years were about the politics and the policies of HIV and AIDS, advancing where we needed to be with appropriations to help us in our communities, but also with the policies we needed to be whole and healthy. In those meetings, in the planning council meetings, not just in Philadelphia, but in planning councils all across the country, there was tension because these planning councils were required by this new federal money through the Rhine-Wide program to prioritize how the money should be spent in each community. What was more important, food or legal services, transportation or housing vouchers? Those critical questions were in discussion month after month. And I can tell you that the advocacy of ACT UP was not lost in any of those meetings. ACT UP yelled at me, and I joined ACT UP in yelling at others. From the governor to the president, from the state legislature to Congress, the role of ACT UP and our advocacy helped push the agenda forward, and the HIV movement took on new dimensions and new power. So much so that the President of the United States in 1990s, President Clinton established the Office of National AIDS Policy at the White House. He established the President's Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS. And that gave us a structure to ensure that the federal government was doing what it could do. But there was schizophrenia in the 1990s because don't ask, don't tell, and the Defense of Marriage Act impugned our humanity. They actually did not help lift us up to get to the human rights and the status that we needed and deserved, especially after going through so much in the 1990s and the 1980s, where we had so many losses, not valuing ourselves, not valuing our people, not valuing the equality of our relationships. That is how we felt about those two important policies. And so advocating against them was part of our work in the 1990s. The 2000s for me were a wake-up call. The first decade of this century was a wake-up call about the real impact of HIV/AIDS on the global community. I remember sitting on my sofa watching President Bush in his State of the Union address not only say the word AIDS, and I sat up, I thought, oh my God, a president has just said the word AIDS in the State of the Union address. But he announced the president's emergency plan on AIDS relief, the PEPFAR program, and our eyes were opened to the global pandemic in a new way. And certainly I was. Within a matter of a year, I was asked by the State Department to do a speaking tour of Africa as an American expert on AIDS and as a person living with HIV. And I did. I did 3 tours to 7 African countries twice for a month. I spoke to churches and in cathedrals. I spoke to schools and universities, to business people, to governors, mayors, and even ambassadors. And in all of those speeches, I was shocked by the lack of knowledge and the thirst for hope. What really shocked me was the unprepared infrastructure to take care of the global pandemic and the amazing number of deaths. I will never forget driving in the embassy van to one of my assignments and seeing a billboard advertising low-cost coffins, wooden coffins. Let's not forget that most of the 32 million people who have died from AIDS are in Africa. The 4th decade of this epidemic was about the convergence of the global and the domestic, because we had a president, Barack Obama, whose parent was Kenyan, and we as HIV advocates advocated with him that if through PEPFAR, we are requiring all of those countries who are receiving our aid to have their own national plan for ending the epidemic, we needed one here in the United States. And through our advocacy, candidate Obama promised that he would deliver, and he did. But the national HIV/AIDS strategy was only part of what we needed. He also pushed for the Affordable Care Act. And that solution made possible access to care. It's hard to believe that last year we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy and the 10th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. They have been transformative, but their work is not done, especially as we look at all the states, particularly in the South, that have not used the leverage of the Affordable Care Act to expand Medicaid. But in that 4th decade, we also learned an important phrase that has become sort of a by-phrase for so many things, and that phrase is biomedical advances. It sort of subsumed that ARVs were now easier to take. And it helped us understand through the HIV continuum that getting to viral suppression is in fact our goal. It helped us understand that PrEP is available to keep people negative. And it helped us understand that by achieving an undetectable viral load, your virus is untransmittable. All of those are subsumed in the topic, the concept of biomedical advances. But our biomedical advances are not all that we have today. We have to look at what is the social support necessary for living a life with HIV for a long and healthy time. So as we go now into this 5th decade of HIV and AIDS, I know that I'm looking forward to this new administration, where just last Saturday, a Black gay man living with HIV was appointed the new director of the Office of National AIDS Policy at the White House, where President Biden has proposed in his budget $670 million new dollars for for prevention and care from the federal government. And I'm looking forward to my own personal goals. My dad died this year. He was 1 month away from 93. Is it possible that I might live that long? And if I do, is Medicare ready for me? Are senior assisted living facilities ready for me? Our policies and our challenge are still unfinished. We have work to do, but I'm hopeful because by remembering the past, I'm working in the present along with all of you to make the future possible for all of us living with and vulnerable to HIV and AIDS. Thank you all for your work, and thank you for including me today.
Jesse, thanks so much for sharing your experiences. You started with saying that remembering is not reliving. But I have to say that your words gave me goosebumps. Thank you for sharing. Okay, Wafaa, it's your turn, and I'm happy to see the flowers on your desk, and I know now that they're regularly there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Theo, and thank you very much, Jesse, and for really your eloquent and very profound remembrances and recollections of 4 decades of this pandemic. I think it's always interesting to think of these anniversary moments, like, and I find myself having the same feelings I usually have during like a World AIDS Day events, because I feel like these kinds of commemorations are very important for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, for to remember, recall, relive, but also as well to re-energize ourselves, to take stock of where we're at and to think ahead. So, and similarly for this 40th anniversary of that MMWR edition so many years ago, brings very similar kinds of feelings and thoughts to me today. And I am one of those persons that I do remember exactly where I was when I first saw that MMWR. Similar, these are kind of the milestones that we all have in our lives that we will always remember. So first of all, I do, just thinking back, as I always do on World AIDS Day, is that you always remember and recall all the people we've lost. And that's really very important. Before we get to all the achievements, all the progress we've made. And in particular, I think sometimes I think back of the people we've lost. And for me as a young physician, really it was a very traumatic experience of losing so many wonderful people. And now in retrospect, of course, over the years, I often think that they should not have been lost, that there were so many mistakes we made in those early years, and we did pay the price by losing so many wonderful people. This was due to the prevailing denial and stigma and discrimination and the lack of leadership. All of these things are what really delayed having the tools at our fingertips and having the will and the resources to be able to have saved lives that we lost. But nonetheless, I think as now and today, as we're living through, I always remind people that this is a very unique moment in history because we are living through 2 pandemics at the same time. And while attention is focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, we still have the HIV pandemic. It's not gone away. It's still with us. But again, it offers us a moment to think about what we have accomplished in terms of HIV and how that should motivate us to think of what lies ahead, but also how relevant that is to confronting the other pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and taking the lessons learned from the HIV response that Jesse talked about so eloquently. I think one of the important things has been, we have to acknowledge that there have been so many advances in tackling HIV, both in terms of prevention, in terms of treatment, and in terms of all the other, the evidence to support all the other supportive interventions that we know matter, that we know make a big difference, whether they be the housing support or the psychosocial support, or, all of these are so fundamental to being able to garner the benefits from the biomedical interventions that people think of as magic bullets. And I always say there is no magic bullet, and none of these scientific advances can really make a dent at a population level, can never make a dent unless we wrap around them all the interventions, the behavioral, the social, the supportive interventions that are part and parcel of trying to get the best out of our biomedical discoveries. So, and we've learned that the hard way with HIV. I think we've learned the hard way, and we've learned that if we don't pay attention to having such comprehensive strategies, is that we will continue to have disparities, and we will continue to have those who have access and those who don't, those who get better outcomes and those who don't. And I think it's the theme of these disparities that we've lived with from day one from HIV, and that we're living now through COVID-19 as well. So I think, again, like if I, in a lot of ways, what lies ahead of us and what we see today in terms of HIV are remarkable, diverse epidemics. It's not one HIV epidemic, it's many HIV epidemics. And the response needs to be as varied as the epidemics are. In this country, we continue to see unacceptably high burden of HIV amongst men who have sex with men, particularly amongst men who have sex with men who are of color, and also among transgender persons and women of color as well in this country. In other parts of the world, the most affected groups are different, and each and every one of these groups also then requires a very nuanced and very contextualized and very tailored response. And we cannot have a cookie cutter approach or keep dreaming of a magic bullet that's just coming down the line, whether it be long-acting treatments or long-acting prevention. They alone are not going to be the answer. They will certainly facilitate our work, but they need to be tailored to the context. They need to be surrounded and wrapped around, the social and supportive interventions that we all know make such a big difference. So as we think ahead, I think we need to think much more with specificity, and we need to think much more of the need for a more sophisticated, more tailored, a more nuanced approach, which means that we need fundamentally to engage the affected people. There are different epidemics, and that means that the people who are affected have to be at the table. They have to be the ones who tell us what needs to be done. They have to be at the table to help design the programs that they need and to help to implement and scale up what needs to be done. And that is at the root of what we fundamentally should be thinking about as we move forward. We need to continue that effort in order to successfully address the diverse HIV epidemics that are part of our reality today. I just want to end by thinking, I think the HIV community and all of you on this call and all the participants and all the panelists are part of that community. We have a lot that we've learned the hard way sometimes, painfully sometimes, but we have a lot that we certainly can share and are sharing in terms of responding to this new pandemic. I think the essence of what Jesse said and what Ron talked about, the essence of community, the essence of the affected individuals, the affected communities, and the centrality of the importance of their role is something we're learning the hard way with COVID. We could have told people that you must engage communities, whether you're planning to do COVID testing or vaccination. Their voice has to be there. They have to be at the table. We did say that, and again, the facts show that needed to happen. We also, as well, learned the hard way that leadership matters, and trusted leadership is very critical, and having divisive leadership is catastrophic at any moment in history, but particularly catastrophic in the context of a pandemic. At a time when people need to be brought together, having leadership that divide us is catastrophic. That's the only way that I can say it, and that's what we've experienced as a catastrophic response here in our country and in several other countries. I think the importance of focusing on evidence and science, and by science, I don't mean just biomedical science, I mean the breadth of behavioral science, implementation science, the need to use evidence to guide our way forward, and to continue to seek answers to questions is very important. To be very vigilant about trying to confront myths and misinformation, because in times like this, these tend to thrive, and we've lived through it with HIV, and we can guard against it as we're now facing the COVID-19 response. And then, of course, importantly and very fundamentally, is that we, while people think of a COVID-19 pandemic as a uniform, it is not uniform, and is affecting our communities in very different ways as well, similar to the HIV pandemic. So just to end, I think it's an important moment of reflection. It's a moment of thinking back on losses, but also thinking back on achievements, and taking stock of what we've learned, and hopefully taking those lessons learned to guide us as we continue to tackle the HIV epidemic or the HIV epidemics, as well as also as we tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Wafaa, so much for sharing your thoughts. I think it is indeed important to remember that remembering is also re-energizing and thinking ahead and making use of all the things that we've learned in the past. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We go now back to Ron Bayer. You have to unmute yourself, Ron.
One second. Okay. Have I done it? Okay. 20 years ago, my colleague Gerald Oppenheimer and I authored a book called AIDS Doctors: Voices from the Epidemic. It was an oral history that sought to capture what it was like to be an AIDS doctor in those years. We took the occasion of this 40th anniversary to reach out to some of the doctors who were included in the AIDS Doctor volume, doctors who were there at the beginning or near the beginning. And one of the remarkable things to keep in mind is when those doctors first dealt with AIDS, they were young men and women in their 30s. Now, those doctors are in their late 60s and 70s. And so it is their memories that I would like to convey to you in what I've been able to gather in my most recent research. So this is really the language, the voice of doctors speaking to us now. In speaking of the early years, when there was virtually nothing physicians could do to save their patients' lives, Molly Cook spent those years at San Francisco General Hospital. She noted how dark it was. People who came to medicine after 1996 cannot fathom how bleak it was. The experience of patient fatalities and subsequent grief was overwhelming. Gerald Friedland, now 82 years old, tried to recapture the strain of the period at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. This is what he said. The onslaught of death and dying of young men and women was beyond usual professional commitments and terribly hard. But I learned how to become skilled at providing people with a decent death. When there was little efficacious treatment, physicians learned to care, to hold hands, and manage a dignified end. In those dark years, these physicians, like their patients, had to endure the burden of stigma, homophobia, and denial of that moment. They also had to witness open refusals to treat and public debates about whether there was a moral duty to take care of and assume the risk of caring for patients with AIDS. Alexandra Levine in Los Angeles recalled the horror of watching a society as a whole turn its back on the suffering, the horror of watching as many of my own colleagues refuse to help, refuse to care, refuse to act as the professionals they were supposed to be. At the same time, these professionals had to confront their own fears, and there were fears. Howard Minkoff, a Brooklyn obstetrician, recalled the fear of surgical teams each time they went into the operating room with HIV-infected women. But he remembered also the heroism of midwives, who at a time when many physicians were looking for excuses to transfer pregnant HIV-infected patients to high-risk centers, how these midwives volunteered to continue to care for all of their patients, regardless of their serostatus. These were the demanding conditions under which many of the professionals who stepped forward forged an identity as AIDS doctors, creating a self-conscious community in which bonds of professional comradeship were formed and would last for years. They spoke of their work in the trenches, of their work on the, quote, front lines, where they shared their fears, sadness, hopes, disappointments, and outrage. Looking back from 2021, some worried that their war stories would no longer be compelling to a younger generation of physicians. Richard Chason, who took on a leadership role in confronting AIDS at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, remarked that, quote, AIDS gave my life and career immediate meaning and value beyond anything I ever expected. Being part of dealing with something so important and having the opportunity to have so enormous an impact on individuals and the larger society is an extraordinary experience. How different it might have been. I could have ended up as a primary care doctor working in an HMO. For physicians who endured more than a decade of suffering on the part of their dying patients, the transformation ushered in by the discovery of highly active antiretroviral therapy was stunning. Chason, who I just referred to, remembering the early challenges of the complex management of multi-drug therapy, also recalled the thrill of the moment. Desperation changed to hope, hope changed to belief, and belief changed to joy. So many patients returned home from the ship of the doomed and went back to living near normal lives. And in reading that observation by Chason, I remember something that Wafaa said many years ago. She said she compared what the context of the waiting room of her clinic was like during the early days, which were somber and depressing. And then in the later years, after 1996, the laughter, the ebullience, the excitement, these were people who were going to live rather than people who were going to die. But the transition of AIDS to a chronic manageable disease paradoxically led some physicians to shift their clinical attention away from HIV. After 15 years, some felt freed from the ethical obligation of following their dying patients. Reflecting on his career trajectory, Joseph O'Neill, who initially pivoted to a national leadership role in the global struggle against AIDS in the Bush administration, said, I realized that my interest in HIV waned as patients in the United States became healthier with heart. For physicians who stayed on, however, something remarkable happened in the late 1990s, something that they never could have anticipated. In describing her relationship with long-standing patients, one doctor remarked on the sense that they were aging together. Paul Volberding, now semi-retired and an early leader in the AIDS world, he was a clinician renowned throughout the world, simply noted that many of his remaining patients were quite elderly. Many observed that they were now treating the usual maladies of older patients, becoming primary care doctors, dealing with colonoscopies, blood pressure management, diabetes care, and prostate cancer screening. With that, I think I'll stop. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you so much, Ron. And Ron, your work was published last week in the New England Journal of Medicine, and we will make sure that the people on this seminar will get a copy of your paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now move to Dana Diamond. Dana, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you again for having me today. My journey didn't go back as far as 40 years ago, but my addiction did. So the beginning of it, I'd say I was in a little bit of a bubble, and it was the addiction bubble. So I didn't see out as far as what I was caught up in. I was an IV drug user. Heroin was my drug of choice. And during that time, in the grips of addiction, I was aware of HIV, but it hadn't quite impacted me yet. And in a way that it was around me, but because everything else was fuzzy, I would describe it as, because of my addiction and that I was so self-absorbed in it, that it didn't really connect. Although folks were dying around me, but again, it didn't take on a personal note. I contracted HIV in 1993. This is 28 years. And that was through sharing a syringe with a friend of mine who we used to get high together often. And I was quite ill one day, withdrawing from heroin, and I ran into him and he gave me a syringe that had heroin in it already. And I used it. I say to this day that I don't know if he even would have told me he was HIV positive, even if he did know at that time or not, what I would have done. But that's how deep that addiction was. And not long after that, I got very, very ill. And I was hospitalized. I had almost 105 fever. I had endocarditis, so this massive infection in my heart. And in the hospital, it was suggested that I take an HIV test. And then, of course, we had to consent in writing. And they pretty much knew already what the result was. But I was in the hospital for a couple of months. Well, I was in for about 4 weeks. And at first, and I was on about 3 different antibiotics, along with heroin that was being brought to the hospital for me, that I would actually inject into my IV where my antibiotics were going. I was always a good patient, followed recommendations, didn't cause problems. So nobody even, they kind of glossed over what was going on with me. I was taking care of other patients, just in that time, I would say, where they were so inundated with cases of HIV. And I was almost looked at as just a great patient who, was helpful to all the other patients on the floor. I got what I call the first of the finger wags. And that's what I used to get. You better stop doing what you're doing or you're not going to live through it. You're not going to live through this again. So stop doing what you're doing. But at no time did anyone kind of tell me how to stop doing what I was doing. My family didn't know anything really about addiction, drugs, etc. So I finally was released from the hospital, and 4 weeks later, I did end up back in the hospital with a second bout of endocarditis. And I ended up in the same hospital, same floor, same room, in the same bed 4 weeks later. And one of my daughters drawings was still on the wall. And somebody asked me, didn't you see this as some kind of sign? Well, I said, absolutely not. When you're in that deep grip of addiction, you don't see those signs. You don't see anything or hear anything. And again, I got those finger wags that you've got to stop doing what you're doing. You're not going to live. Well, the second time that I was hospitalized, by then, of course, I didn't go back to get my results, but the results were waiting for me when I was hospitalized again. And they said, you know, you've got to take this pill. It was AZT. And the doctor says you have to take it. And we don't know how long you'll live or not live, but you got to stop doing what you're doing and take this pill. And I remember slowly feeling like I was slipping away, so to speak. I started to get very swollen, my entire body. I was about this big at the time. And I didn't want to eat, which is very unusual. I felt like I couldn't get up. I had a feeling of what I would describe as an outer body experience. Not that I really, you know, knew much about that, but I just felt myself at one point like my soul was leaving my body. And all I knew was I started to see myself in the hospital bed. And I know that it wasn't like this before I took that pill. And so I told the nurse to stop giving it to me. And she said, no, the doctor said you have to take it. And I said, well, you could tell the doctor to take it because I can't anymore. And I started to come back to life. And at that time, again, through other situations, nobody even suggested how I could stop using. And I ended up in the criminal justice system for a little while. And eventually a judge said, you know, her problem is not crimes. I, you know, had a long history of, you know, sex work to get the drugs, the money for the drugs. And he said, she needs treatment. And when I got into treatment is when I started to really see everything that had been happening around me and got a lot of support. When I was given my HIV diagnosis, I was also given an AIDS diagnosis, and as well as hepatitis C, which I am now cured from. And I started to get that support, and I started to learn more about HIV. And one of the other women in treatment was going to a school all about HIV. And I said, what school is this? You know, the only schools I know is I went to an all girls private school. It was college preparatory. I didn't know about anything else. So when she said it was called Arrive, which is Exponents' flagship program, how we started all those years ago, 1988, at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And yes, Teo, it was, you know, for the acronym Arrive was AIDS risk reduction for IV drug users and ex-offenders. And it was one of the only places in New York City where you can get the information and the education without having to already stop using drugs. So it was about the people who needed this information were people who were using drugs. And, you know, so at our root, we are a harm reduction organization where we also have outpatient treatment and many other supportive services and programming. And when I went there to get this education, I pretty much never left. I went in 1997 and then I became a peer and I volunteered and interned for a year. And I began working there in 1998. So I'm in almost 23 years full-time staff there. And that's how I was able to get my credentials as an alcohol and substance use counselor and supervise a team of harm reduction counselors who are all credentialed. And I know that it always seemed like a very strange concept that it's still considered treatment, but it's harm reduction treatment. It was crucial at that time, especially then, that everyone got this information, especially those who were still using drugs, who are still putting themselves at risk. And early on, I just realized that all my experiences around so many circumstances where I could have died, I just felt like I didn't for a purpose. And that's when I started to see that there was a purpose for me to still live. There had to be something I'm supposed to do with this. I'm still living through all the odds, against all the odds. We could go on for days, but I won't. But I knew that I had to do something. I knew that my purpose was to tell my story, to continue to provide a safe environment for people to explore themselves, their behaviors, and learn what they wanted to learn, how they wanted to learn. And so when I, from that time at Exponents, we were always encouraged to tell our stories, where a lot of people who worked in typical substance use counseling programs were told, you never give of yourself, you never tell your story. And here we did just the opposite. We wanted to create a safe space where people would understand that we are all the same. We have all experienced something that helps us learn about ourselves and learn about our communities. And I continued to tell my story. I now also, I'm in my 4th year of being a spokesmodel for the HIV Stops With Me campaign for New York State. And again, that's about telling our stories to help identify folks who may need to get tested for HIV, to help get them connected with organizations like Exponents, where we could get the folks connected to care. All about helping to build our communities and not tear it down anymore. And just give each other the support that we need. The worst thing I can say is it's happening, and that we are finding ourselves not able to end this epidemic, is from the stigma, because the stigma is still so great. Yes, in different parts of the country it's worse, but it's bad here too. And in New York, there's still folks who, have certain ideas about people who contract HIV, and that it will not hit them and that it does not affect them. So stigma around substance use, stigma around your sexuality, stigma around sex, stigma around all these things, and people aren't talking. And I know that if I have a voice, which I have found, that I have an obligation to tell my story, to help at least one other person who may see themselves as needing to get an HIV test. This whole year of COVID and what we had worked so hard, it created a lot of feelings in the community that we could respond so quickly, and yet we're still 40 years and haven't been able to stop HIV. It's a hard path, I want to say, for people to understand, and people are very bitter. And I believe that what we learned about HIV helped us to create this vaccine for COVID-19 faster. And I believe that the COVID-19 vaccine research will also help us further in HIV. So I just keep doing this work in hopes that there will continue to create that safe space for folks to come and ask questions, for folks to come and learn. But if we don't stop the stigma, we're not going to stop HIV. We're blessed to have the science that we have around prevention. We can prevent HIV. We've got PrEP. We know undetectable equals untransmittable. But if we can't get the rest of the folks tested to know their status so they can get treated and become undetectable and not transmit, that's our gap. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. It would be wonderful to have a PrEP against stigma, isn't it, if we could do that? But then
Yes.
we would have to get people to take it. Thank you for sharing your personal experiences. They're inspiring, and we're happy that you're still here, and indeed you have a purpose.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we are moving to our last presenter, Abram Finkelstein. Go ahead.
My word, I have to unmute. So I'm sure you've noticed I've been madly taking notes as all of you were talking. You're filling me with ideas, and I wanted to thank everyone at Columbia for this kind invitation to have this conversation, but I also wanted to thank Robert for offering Alex's wise quote to start us off, which highlights what I hope to address today. Alex is correct. In America, the pandemics are different, but America is the same. The landscape is the same. So let me start by saying I'm neither a public health professional nor a social historian, but I'm a serious wonk in all of those areas. And I've dedicated my practice to how we communicate and study these questions. In particular, the way that historiographies mold our conceptualization of the commons and the way cultural storytelling completely torques the construction of shared language surrounding pandemic preparedness, which we're seeing right before our eyes, but certainly happened in the early days of AIDS. And we also, it torques the way in which we think about human mortality. So today I want to talk about AIDS, the brand, if you will, since communications is my area. Outside the walls surrounding academic contemplation of all of these questions, most Americans have only recently become aware of the morbidity and mortality weekly, and have done so in relation to the recent reports of the politicization of the CDC during COVID-19. So I think it's important to note here that, and some of us have, that many of the current articles, exhibitions, books, and programming marking the 40th anniversary of HIV and AIDS may be referred to a different point of demarcation, the anniversary of the first New York Times article on the subject of AIDS, which in fact followed both the 1981 MMWR and the report by Lawrence Mass in the New York Native. It was not the first time anyone talked about HIV/AIDS. So what does it mean to think of an article in the Times as a cultural marker, and how does that underscore the mutability and the flaws in cultural storytelling? It happens that this year the MMWR is a topical point of reference because of COVID-19, but for decades, I've been asked where I was when I first saw the article in the Times. As it happens, 1981 was also the year that the man I decided I was going to build my life around started showing signs of immunosuppression. And the arts communities of Lower Manhattan were already aware of this secret hiding in plain sight way before any reporting on it. During his second and third hospitalizations, we had to requisition pentamidine directly from the CDC. By 1984, he was dead. And it's what led me to co-found the tiny political collective that went on to design the Silence Equals Death poster a year before the social movement it's come to represent even took form. So I've been thinking about this and dealing with these questions for really long, since 1981. As an artist and writer who survived the terrors of AIDS, my work explores the layered meanings of individual agency during moments of pandemic crisis, from political organizing as a mode of survival to the acknowledgement that memorialization is as much a mode of cultural erasure as it is of historical solidification. And finally, I think a lot about the objectness of witnessing, by which I mean the ability of cultural memory to cast a shadow. Through years of exploring, thinking about these questions, I've come to the conclusion that America is no longer a country in any traditional sense. It's actually more accurately a digitized procession of symbols, archetypes, and codes, all of which articulate the vacillation between America's promise and its cruelty. But this fluctuation, this vacillation, is far too potent to be strictly described as some kind of alphanumeric reinterpretation of Western hegemonies that are responsible for America's fantasias of abundance. What's currently being mapped within our social spaces with regard to the way we think about HIV and AIDS, and COVID-19, what's being mapped in our social spaces is not simply a re-rendering of the power narratives that have existed since the Enlightenment, reinterpreted for communication technologies. It's far more primordial, and it signifies deeper dilemmas. So having survived HIV/AIDS, I'm now on my second pandemic, one that will, for generations to come, change the meanings of capital, science, governance, community, family, relationships, service, risk, pedagogy, art, work, travel, security, and even how we think about home, the word home. But amongst my cohort who survived HIV/AIDS in those early days, we're acknowledging a third type of 40th anniversary, which is that of a life lived entirely on pandemic footing, which I'm only beginning to realize is a separate phenomenon, if you will. We were long ago forced to learn the intricacies of epidemiology and microbiology and immunology and pharmacology and public health policies, which are subjects that as an artist I was attempting to transition away from, but I'm called on to again consider in COVID-19. And if I've learned anything about these subjects, it's that when we talk about pandemics, we will eventually downshift to the nature of social memory. And in the wake of the death and suffering that pandemics cause, the question of cultural mourning, not just how we talk about it, not just the language we craft to describe it, not just which images become doppelgangers for whole sets of ideas, but how we then culturally deal with the implications of it. We are in fact, at moments like this, talking about historiography and about how histories are constructed as they unfurl, which is exactly what happened with HIV and AIDS and is happening now with COVID-19 if you care to look at it that way. So I also believe that information technologies will necessitate a swifter transition from telling the story of this pandemic to its storytelling, which is a very different thing, and I would say is more accurately a dense web of hegemonic power narratives than it is a system scaffolded by fact. And all of those things remain true about HIV and AIDS as well. And ultimately, we're going to cease referring to our pandemic response as a healthcare crisis once it morphs into a crisis of remembering, which it will. That's what happened. That's exactly what happened with the story of HIV/AIDS, and it's the subject we're here to consider today. So I want to focus on communications for a second, and forgive me for wonking out, but in advertising, ubiquity is a key component to commercial dominance. But marketing dollars alone can't guarantee that a message will capture zeitgeist and lead to an advertising franchise or build a legacy brand, that sort of messaging the content requirements for that kind of messaging require a more granular reading of audience and an even deeper reading of social context. Content clears a space on the social landscape, like what we say clears a space, but context is what transforms it into dominion. So I'm nervous about this analogy because when held up against the social significance of political agency or public health or life and death, the kind of sovereignty sought through multinational corporate branding is completely trivial culturally. Lives don't hang in the balance every time Coca-Cola struggles to reinvent what it's already been selling you. But we live in an image commons, and the same rules apply to social movements and public health as to the marketing of soft drinks. Content and social context are everything. So examples of this particular interweaving of capabilities and realities are frequently drawn from the cultural output associated with ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in New York, some of the work I've had a hand in. And our strategic thinking was molded by our proximity to media culture and cultural and political centers in Eastern America. And it's often studied as a template for how to imagine image ecospheres that constitute themselves in ways that can be deployed for social justice, which is my life's work, as it turned out. To be sure, there are useful lessons from the study of this period of cultural production, but archives do not necessarily help us understand how or why these images work. And they're powerless to untangle this kind of complex web of social context, connecting this work product to grassroots organizing or policy making, or the particularity of these images that came out of ACT UP in this case. To explain what I mean, I just want to offer a set of appraisals that sort of represent the interlocking nature of this kind of communication. One of the reasons why you know about the silence equals death poster, let's use that as an example, is that the particularity of the moment in which we designed that work. So it was a moment when a lack of societal candor about the vastness of human sexuality exacerbated by the rise of the religious right in America. Sorry, I'm giving you all a history lesson. It coincided with the rise of the religious right in America. And when coupled with the deliberate pace necessitated by epidemiological analysis, what was happening in research and surveillance communities, the analysis, it was easily fanned into a bonfire by the concomitant deregulation of electronic media that triggered the 24/7 cable news cycle in America, which was an uncharted social landscape at that time. All of these things happened at the same time. So this is where AIDS storytelling began. It began at the beginning when the spike in airtime made it easy for producers to greenlight AIDS content to deliver information to panicked audiences who thought they could catch AIDS from a mosquito bite or a toilet seat. I swear to God, that's what they were talking about on cable news when cable news became a thing. The press was so hungry for data and analysis, and ACT UP not only provided tons of it, it also offered impactful and succinct visuals and generous amounts of B-rolls to go underneath all their storytelling. So when evaluating this particular body of activist output that came out of ACT UP New York, it bears remembering that the phenomenology of the media landscape on which it proliferated was specific to its own historical moment. it is consequently irreproducible. And any useful analysis requires interdisciplinary collaboration, which is why I was so excited by having a conversation today with this group of brains. In addition to all of those things that I said about the media landscape, Reagan's deregulation mad America created tax abatements for Manhattan real estate developers, which led to a building boom that triggered a radical increase in the construction sites that this visual output needed for display, making posting organizing material a relatively inexpensive and high visibility form of mass communication within the highly activated street life of New York. Deregulation also had this cloud effect. In the cloud effect of deregulation, it also fostered a receptivity within the American pharmaceutical industry and the FDA to support activist demands for the fast tracking of HIV drugs that were in or wanted to enter the development pipeline, which is underscored again by this B-roll or these mediagenic images of activists, which also implied a burgeoning marketplace for AIDS therapy. So all of these things are happening at once. So the reason I'm saying is that images have an undeniable cultural power and intrinsic significance to curators, historians, and archivists, but archives cannot, in and of themselves, reflect the intricacies of communications in neoliberalism without exhaustive research needed to connect all of the dots and make meaning of this material. I just fast-tracked, I whitewatered through one tiny set of such information points. So I just want to close by saying that texts become an essential component to helping us understand the social use of the story of HIV and AIDS for future activists and culture workers. And so does interdisciplinary analysis, like what we're attempting today, which I think is the most productive way to consider the ideas that we're exploring during this commemoration. So thank you for filling me with ideas. I've been making mad notes and those are my thoughts on the subject.
Thank you so much, Abram. You refer to a conversation, and of course, this is not yet much of a conversation because we're not yet talking with each other, but I hope that there will be an opportunity soon to share more extensively your ideas and our work. I think this is one of the few panels where I see panelists not all the time in agreement. Usually there is disagreement, but there doesn't seem to be disagreement here. I'm very happy to see that we are hopefully looking ahead and being re-energized by remembering the report in the MMWR or the New York Times. We have a few minutes left for people, for other participants in this seminar to say something, to share their perspective, or to respond to something that they've heard. And if you would like to say something, put your name in the chat so that we can unmute you and give you the opportunity to speak. And if Lorraine Afflito is still in the audience, I would like to invite her to say something about her experiences. I'm not sure if she's still here, but if she would like to, there she is. I would like to give her the opportunity to say something. Lorraine.
Hi, good morning. One moment. I'm in another meeting. Okay, sorry. Good morning, everyone. I just, as I said in the chat, I really do appreciate this commemorative talk. This was the start of my career in 1980, and in 81, I was again caring for patients at the ICU at Roosevelt, and we were part we put together the first grand rounds on this unknown disease in the Wilson Auditorium at the old Roosevelt Hospital, which is now Mount Sinai West. And that whole time, it was prior to social media and prior to communication as we know it today. So it was really getting the word out, just trying to get the word out and providing just care for this particular patient population was a real battle, given the stigmatization of the patients. And at that, our first patient happened to be one of our own medical attendings, which ended up being reported by Michael Greco in the MMWR report of the first cases. And then I don't know if it was this same report, but it was the first reported case from New York City to MMWR. And so I just wanted to say thank you for all of the hard work you've done over these last 40 years, continuing this very important focus. And but emotionally, that emotional experience has never left me. It took me many, as I heard other speakers say, the entry of COVID-19, it brought back a lot of memory and a lot of the same feelings I had when I was young at that time. But it actually looks like a better world now, except for injustices. A lot of the advances in medicine did help this time. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Lorraine. Joanne Mantal. Joanne, you're welcome to share your view.
Joanne, you'll have to unmute on your end.
Joanne, if you're talking, you have to unmute, otherwise we won't hear you. Stephen, do we have another person waiting, or?
Nope, but again, feel free to raise your hand or enter your name in the chat, and I'll allow you to speak on my end.
And if one of the panelists wants to comment on something he or she has heard, you're welcome to share your responses, of course.
Teo, this is Jesse. I'm happy to just share a final thought after hearing these magnificent other co-panelists. The power of storytelling, which both Abram and I think we witnessed with Dana particularly, and connecting it to the data that we heard from Ron and our other panelists today, is the power of advocacy. And over this last year with COVID-19, we've seen how the stories about vaccine hesitancy, about racial inequities, have to be told from an individual level as well as from a cross-cultural level. And these stories are so powerful. When you sit in front of a legislator and connect your story in your district to their vote in Congress, that is powerful. When you connect your story, particularly for allies of people living with and affected by HIV, that you know someone, you love someone, you care for someone, that's where the stigma of HIV starts to break down. The burden of the storytelling being on the people living with HIV can no longer continue. It needs to be a story about all those who care about HIV. And I think the COVID-19 is helping us see how when you care about others than just yourself, we can have a huge transformation in terms of the public health and also a transformation in human rights.
I wanted to throw my hat in the ring there, Jesse, to point out that because I do speak a lot about this topic, I find with younger activists, younger queer activists in particular, struggle with the idea that they're not entitled to this story, that it's something that they did not experience. But this is the story of the human world. This is the story of mortality and social justice and the commons. This isn't just, we have told our individual stories, and as powerful as they are, Jesse, as an organizing tool, I think it's important for people who were not there to realize that this is their story too.
Okay, well, I think this is the perfect ending. Thank you, Jesse, for reflecting on the speakers, and Abram for getting back to Jesse about this. It's important. I would like to thank everybody who participated in this seminar for being here, and of course, especially the speakers for sharing their vision, but also their personal experiences, and in doing so, inspiring all of us. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Well done. Thank you.